All right, let's dive right in. Today we're tackling Bernard Malamud's A Summer's Reading. We're dropped right into 1950s Brooklyn, summer's in full swing, and we meet George Stoyanovich. George, well, he's a young guy, kind of just drifting, he's fresh out of high school, or not so fresh, he's actually a dropout.
And that setting, 1950s Brooklyn, that's not just background noise in Malamud, is it? For someone like George, working class, not a ton of options, dropping out back then, it hit different than it might now.
Oh, totally. It's like you can practically feel the weight of expectation bearing down on him.
Yeah.
The story really captures that sense of unfulfilled potential, doesn't it? Malamud paints this vivid picture of George just killing time cleaning, glued to the radio, listening to baseball. Anything to avoid those questions from? Well, everyone. Got a job yet, George? Finished school? You can just imagine it.
Especially with how Malamud weaves in the family dynamics, right? You've got Sophie, his sister, working her tail off to keep things afloat. Their mom's gone, their dad's... Well, let's just say he's not exactly a pillar of support. This isn't just your typical teenage restlessness. George is carrying a lot more baggage than people realize.
So much unspoken pressure there.
Yeah.
And that's where Mr. Kenzar enters the scene. Picture this. George is on one of his walks just trying to clear his head, and he bumps into this older guy from the neighborhood. You get the sense that Mr. Kenzar has seen it all, enjoys his drinks a bit too much, but still has this air of, I don't know, maybe gruff wisdom. I feel like we all know Mr. Kenzar.
Oh, absolutely. He's that classic neighborhood fixture, always observing, always with an opinion. But underneath that rough exterior, you get the sense that he genuinely wants to connect with George, even if he doesn't quite know how.
And there's this awkward exchange, almost by accident. George lets it slip that he's spending his summer, get this, buried in books. Not just any books, though. He claims he's tackling a list of 100. Ah, yes, the infamous reading list. Of course, we, the readers, know it's all a front, a complete fabrication.
Right. Talk about setting yourself up for disaster. Have you ever been tempted to, I don't know, embellish the truth a little, even if the stakes weren't quite this high?
Oh, I think we've all been there at some point, haven't we? That desire to be seen as more accomplished, more knowledgeable. It's a very human impulse, and that's what Malamud captures so brilliantly here. That lie, those 100 books, they become this symbol of George's aspirations.
It's almost like that lie, as flimsy as it is, gives him a sense of control, right? Like he's finally got a plan. Precisely. But of course we know it can't last forever. Sooner or later, that facade is going to crumble. And boy, does it crumble in this incredibly uncomfortable encounter. Picture this. George is walking down the street, desperately trying to avoid any chance encounters with you-know-who, when bam, he runs right into Mr. Kenzara. Again.
You can practically feel the tension rising off the page. Poor George, he's trapped.
And Malamud's descriptions are just perfect here. He talks about Mr. Kenzara's breath smelling like the inside of a beer barrel, which just adds to that sense of George's mounting panic. But beneath that gruffness, there's still this glimmer of genuine concern for Mr. Kenzara.
And then comes the million-dollar question. Name me one book on that list that you read this summer. I mean, talk about a record scratch moment.
It's like all the air gets sucked out of the room, isn't it? George is completely exposed, caught in his lie. And what's fascinating is how Malamud uses this moment to shift the story's focus. We go from outward appearances to this deep dive into George's internal struggle.
He's going from trying to impress others to facing his own self-deception. It's a recipe for disaster.
It is. But maybe, just maybe, it's also a turning point.
We're back and still knee-deep in A Summer's Reading. When we left off, George was totally busted, standing there with his lie exposed. I'm dying to know, where does Malamud take us from there?
Well, in typical Malamud fashion, things don't exactly explode the way you might expect. George, he retreats. Big time.
Yeah, I remember that. He basically becomes a hermit in his own home, right?
Exactly. He hides out in his room, avoiding everyone. Sophie, Mr. Kenzara, the whole neighborhood. It's like he's gone back to square one, but now it's even worse, you know? The weight of that lie is just eating him alive.
You'd think he'd do something drastic to redeem himself. Maybe actually try to read those 100 books just to prove everyone wrong.
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But Malamud, he's not interested in easy answers or predictable plot twists. What he gives us instead is this quiet, almost painful exploration of how change really happens. It's not about grand gestures, it's about those internal shifts, the slow, sometimes agonizing process of facing up to who we are.
And who we're not, right? I mean,
Yeah.
George has a lot to face up to, but it's not like he's going through this alone. Sophie, his sister, she doesn't let him off the hook so easily.
Oh, not at all. That scene where she confronts him, man, that's some powerful stuff. Remember that line? She lays it all out there. In that case, you're not worth a buck of my hard-earned money. Why should I break my back for you? Go on out, you bum, and get a job. You can tell it's not just about the lie, it's about this deep frustration that's been building up in her.
It's like she sees his potential, maybe even more clearly than he does, but she also sees him wasting it.
Right, and that's what makes it sting even more. Because it comes from a place of love, you know? She wants better for him. But sometimes tough love is the only way to shake someone out of their own self-deception.
That's Sophie for you. Always
Yeah.
telling it like it is.
Yeah.
But there's another character kind of lurking in the background of the story that I want to circle back to. Remember that old shoemaker? The one who sits under the street lamp every night, totally absorbed in the newspaper.
Oh, absolutely. He's like this silent symbol throughout the story. What do you make of him?
Well, on the surface, he's the complete opposite of George, right? Content with his simple life, finding peace and routine. But there's something about the way Malamud describes him, this quiet dignity, this sense of purpose. I don't know, it makes you wonder if maybe, just maybe, George sees something of himself in that old man.
Interesting. You think it's a reflection of what George could be? Or maybe what he's afraid he'll never be?
Maybe a bit of both. But anyway, all this introspection, all this internal turmoil, it has to lead somewhere.
Right. It does. On one of those sweltering summer nights when the heat in his room becomes unbearable, both literally and figuratively, George finally does something completely unexpected.
He finally cracks open a book.
Not quite. He does something even bolder. He walks to the library in the middle of the night.
We're back. And you know what we're still thinking about, right? George, standing outside that library in the dead of night, after a whole summer of, well, basically avoiding anything remotely like a book, what's he going to do?
It's such a powerful image, isn't it? Because it's not just a library, is it? It's like he's standing at the edge of everything he's been running from and everything he might become.
Okay, but here's what gets me. We don't actually see George transform into a scholar overnight, do we? I mean, does Malamud even tell us what happens once he steps inside?
And that's the beauty of Malamud's writing. He doesn't spell it out for us. He leaves that final scene open, inviting us, the readers, to fill in the blanks. Where some authors might hit us over the head with a big dramatic ending, Malamud gives us something much more subtle, more true to life.
So it's about potential then,
Yeah.
not necessarily the outcome.
Exactly. It's that moment of possibility that's so powerful. George surrounded by all those books, not as symbols of his lie, but as a representation of a future he might actually choose. What do you think, as our listener, is more impactful in a story? Seeing someone make a change or seeing the potential for change right before it happens?
I've always been a sucker for an open ending, that's for sure. Like, we've gone on this whole journey with George, seen his struggles, his mistakes, his small victories, and now, at the very end, Malamud hands us the reins. Let us imagine what that next chapter might hold.
And isn't that what makes a story stay with you long after you finish reading it? That space for reflection, for your own interpretation. George may or may not become a voracious reader, but that single step into the library speaks volumes. It tells us that he's chosen a different path, even if that path is still unfolding.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into a summer's reading, what's the takeaway? Why should this story matter to someone who might not have picked up a Malamud book before?
It's a story about the lies we tell ourselves, the expectations we carry, and the often messy process of becoming who we're meant to be. But ultimately, it's a story about hope, about the power of even the smallest step taken in the right direction. George's journey reminds us that it's never too late to challenge ourselves, to seek out knowledge, to embrace the possibility of transformation, even if it means starting in the dead of night, surrounded by the quiet promise of unread books.
Beautifully put. That's a wrap on this episode of The Deep Dive. We'll be back next time with another deep dive into the world of literature. Until then, happy reading, everyone.